company. Secretary Gutierrez joined ACG from Citi, where he served as vice chairman of the Institutional Clients Group and as a member of the Senior Strategic Advisory Group. He was born in Havana, Cuba. He's married to Edilia and has 3 grown children. Please allow me to introduce you, Secretary Carlos Gutierrez.
Thank you. Buenos dias and good morning to all. It is a pleasure to be here speaking with you today on the impact that sports has on economic development and social inclusion, and how we can better understand the power of sports in driving social and economic change. You know, I always use the anecdote about sports of a personal experience that I had. I had the good fortune of living in Mexico in 1986 when the World Cup took place in Mexico. And I describe the people, I tell them that what it's like to be living in a country where the World Cup is taking place is that throughout 3 weeks, all your problems and all your animosities don't exist. And I recall that during that time, people would say, you know, I owe that person, I owe you 100 pesos. And they would say, don't worry about it. Pay me after the World Cup. Everything was after the World Cup. It was like a 3-week paradise. Everyone was friends. There was no such thing as enemies or arguments. It was all about the beauty and the joy of experiencing a World Cup of soccer. So that is one of my experiences, but I think everyone in the world has an experience of joy, sometimes of sadness, but always of emotion and passion when it comes to sports. I've had a long relationship with the OAS. It's a pleasure to be here. And I have a recent association with ICSS and have come to value and understand the tremendous role that they've taken and the very noble mission of this organization. Let me just start by saying what we all know, that sports empowers often marginalized groups and develops human capital. These factors are essential in promoting social and economic development from the grassroots level up. So we all know that there are a lot of athletes who start from scratch, who start playing soccer on a street with a ball, who come from very modest beginnings, but they have a tremendous talent, and with that talent, they go a long way. And it's not only that, but it's also the impact on societies that have never had the freedom to be able to enjoy sports. So one innovative way to empower women and girls, for example, in Afghanistan, women and girls are climbing mountains through sports nonprofits that train women in mountaineering while also providing leadership classes. They would have never had this opportunity before. Today, that is something available to them. Regionally, of course, we all know examples of great athletes who have come from very, very modest beginnings. And I think of Juan Román Riquelme, and I think of Pelé, people who have reached great heights because they had a chance to play soccer when they were young, when they were kids. At the national and international level, sport already represents a booming economic industry. The effects of the sport industry also spill over into other sectors, adding to overall national and regional productivity. And let me just give you some numbers here, which I think are pretty staggering and a lot bigger than I would have expected. The Brasileiro Club revenue was $1.17 billion in 2012, according to Deloitte. In the UK, the value added of sports activities are estimated to be 1.7% of GDP. 1.7% of GDP. And that is all the turnover and all the industries that rely on sports, whether it's the food industry, whether it's automotive industries, whether it's hotel industries, but that is the impact that a sports culture can have on an economy. Mega events like the World Cup and the Olympics provide hosts with additional economic opportunity by ushering in international investment, increasing trade, increasing tourism, increasing cooperation between private and social sectors. In many cases, people discover countries and then they come back. A Berkeley economist by the name of Andrew Rose has said that trade is around 30% higher for countries that have hosted Olympics or World Cup trade than those who have not. And that is an amazing number, because companies that host Olympics and that host World Cups tend to be more open, and therefore they have huge advantages. Harvard SSRN study indicates that mega events can bring together local, corporate, and nonprofit actors, increase local identity, increase understanding, and also a sense of wanting to contribute to that country. Sport is a multi-billion-dollar industry with significant impact on a nation's economy, and not only a nation, but a region's economy. We need to be realistic about the impact of sports can have on economies and society. There are no silver bullets. It's not a guarantee. Currently, there are no uniform ways to measure how sport influences economies and societies and existing institutions. And very often it's all anecdotal. You know, we had a lot of tourism in Atlanta, but what happened to all the buildings? What happened to all the construction? What happened to the infrastructure that was built? Did it pay off? There are very few people who have even tried to measure the impact. And this is something, again, that I credit ICSS for taking the lead. The sports industry is valued at $150 billion and is growing at an average of 5% a year, according to Deloitte and according to the ICSS studies. And we know, again, it helps economies, but we just don't know by how much. We don't know for how long. We don't know how to measure that. And the more we do that, the more we can elevate the importance of these big events. A realistic look at the sport in the wake of the FIFA scandal, I think is important. There are allegations of financial impropriety, corruption, human rights abuses. Mega events often overpromise and underdeliver on the economic gains that they bring. Noted sports economist Andrew Simbalist said the cost of large-scale construction related to events is often borne by taxpayers, and impact studies have been widely discredited. The idea that if you build these 7 stadiums, you're going to have X benefit, those claims have been discredited. So there's always a tendency to want to promise that everything will change if we just invest all the money we need to have this event. And again, we can't measure it the way we can measure a business, the way we can measure an investment. Corruption and manipulation of sports competitions have become global phenomenon, especially now. That is the big story of the day. And this is according to, of course, ICSS and the Sorbonne study. This is reflected by the current FIFA scandal and the North and South American CONCACAF and CONMEBOL soccer. They've been at the center of the investigation. And this should be talked about, and we should be open about this. And if there's any place that we should be absolutely transparent and willing to discuss this, is here. And thanks to ICSS, we have a forum to take these issues on and to not sweep them under the rug. We have a problem. And thanks to you, that problem is going to be addressed. There have also been multiple reports of labor-related issues, especially concerning the 2022 World Cup in Qatar. Reports indicate that over 1,000 migrant workers have died in poor working conditions. Those are issues that we can't just let slide. We can't just let slide because the 3 weeks of the World Cup is a lot of fun. We have to think about sports in a holistic fashion. So I applaud ICSS. I applaud ICSS for taking the leadership role in an area where, in many ways, it has been either ignored or overshadowed by the excitement of sport. So to reinstate and to protect the integrity of sport, that is the mission of ICSS. And they're doing that through promoting good governance, a call for transparency, a call for accountability, and a call for human rights in sport. ISS has partnered with credible institutions like the Sorbonne and the Harvard Kennedy School, and they're creating, again, parameters to better understand the dynamics of sports, all the different dynamics that flow from a tournament or from a specific series. Calls for supervision of sport like any other industry. Every industry in the world has some kind of supervision. They have rules, they have regulations, they have audits, they have transparency. All of that is missing today in sport. Again, thanks to ICSS, we are bringing that to the table. So, technologically innovative solutions have been created. In fact, there's a mobile app with UNICEF where people can report instances of child abuse during 2014, during the World Cup. That was available. There are a lot of other things in the works, and just imagine what we can do if we make this a priority. And in many ways, the FIFA scandal should be a motivation to tackle this with passion and aggressiveness, because we're talking about sport. We're talking about something that everyone loves. I think we can all agree on that. So I want to applaud ICSS for their leadership, for taking on something that needs to be addressed. And I, for one, am extremely proud of my relationship with ICSS. Thank you for being here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary Gutierrez, for those comments. Ladies and gentlemen, going back to the panel, I'd like to introduce to you the chair, Mr. Sean McCarthy, an intelligence and security professional with over 35 years of experience in both the public and private sectors, and currently the executive director of the ICSS enterprise. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Sean McCarthy.
Well, first of all, I'd just like to thank Secretary Gutierrez for that very enlightening introduction and appropriate segue into this panel. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, sport as we know it has the power to accomplish many objectives. We've heard it this morning, we've heard it from the esteemed gentleman from the IOC. Secretary Gutierrez has just alluded to that as well. And amongst those objectives are the promotion of fantastic concepts such as fair play, honesty, meritocracy, reconciliation, and in some cases, sport is used as a peace builder. But sport also has tremendous power to create economic growth and wealth, but in some cases, disproportionate levels of wealth. And I think our biggest challenge when we look at how sport as a vector to grow economic, as an economic vector, how do we actually get a more fair and equitable distribution of that wealth, particularly in countries around the world whose economies are yet to grow. The Secretary mentioned the figures. I actually had them here, but that's fine. He mentioned them already, so I won't go into details. That Deloitte had mentioned, an estimated value of $150 billion, an average growth rate of 5% over the last 3 years and growing. But be that as it may, the reality is that many cities, countries, and regions yet still struggle to actually leverage that potential appropriately. And we do not have, as you mentioned, there is no silver bullet yet. It's an immense challenge to try and understand, first of all, if you think about sport as a sector, as a formal sector, what is inside that sector, what transcends that sector into other key economic sectors such as tourism, infrastructure. And that's one of the biggest challenges as we try to grapple to understand how we get a measure on effectively what is in that ecosystem called sport, and then how we actually start to help cities, countries, regions think about effective strategies to deliver, and I say sustainable, and I emphasize sustainable growth. We have major sporting events. They come along. The nations have a tremendous feel-good factor for the duration of that effect. It's natural, and they should. But then once that event fades and recedes in the background, and the populations are left looking at the tax dollars and the tax bill, then we start to see this percolation or resentment that actually starts to grow within society and populations. And rightly so, they ask the questions as to how has this event led to sustainable economic growth and development. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce the three panelists, and I'd ask them to come up and take their seats. And as they do, I'll just provide a brief introduction to them. And I'm going to turn it over to these panelists to share with us some of their ideas and some of their thoughts and their experiences around how sport can actually play a role as a vector for both financial and social benefits. So thank you. So without further ado, I'm going to first introduce Senor Manuel Portilla Dieguez. He is the Subdirector of Physical Culture at CONADI, the National Commission for Sport in Mexico. Manuel began his political career as a local member of parliament for the Green Party in the state of Mexico, where he served as the president of the Commission on Human Rights. Subsequently, he was appointed as the Deputy Director General of the National Commission of Physical Culture and Sports. The next esteemed panelist is a lady called Marcela Escobari. Marcela is the Executive Director of the Harvard University Kennedy School of Government at the Center for International Development. She's also the head of the Americas region at the OTF Group, and she has advised governments on how to increase export competitiveness and harness the private sector to eradicate poverty. Marcela currently serves on the board of Root Capital, an organization that is financing rural development. And she was in 2013, she was actually named as one of the young global leaders by the World Economic Forum. She has co-authored a book on In the River They Swam. It's about essays from around the world on enterprise solutions to help to try and eradicate poverty. She has a BA in economics from Swarthmore College and an MA in public policy from the Harvard Kennedy School. Our third panelist, esteemed lady, Rose Rackus. She served as the director of USAID in Paraguay, and she has worked on projects throughout the region that focus on strengthening democracy, improving health of nations, environmental concerns, and growing nations' economies. So welcome to our three panelists, and give me a second to just take my seat there, and we will ask them to contribute their thoughts. Thank you. So I guess it's a question of ladies first. Marcela, the Center for International Development, as we alluded to, is working on a sponsored research program to better understand how sport plays a role in economic development. A key part of that is what is called the Atlas of Macroeconomic Complexity. Now, this is an instrument or a methodology approach that actually maps out what countries produce, what they're good at producing, and who they actually export that to. But I wonder if you could just allude a little bit more about that study, but also how that relates to actually using sport as an instrument for economic development.
Does this work? Yeah?
Can you hear Marcelo?
Can you hear me? All right, perfect. Raise your hands if you don't hear me, and then I'll speak louder. Right, so the work that we're doing at the Center for International Development,
No.
Yeah? No? Doesn't work? No? Can I turn it off?
Button's red.
It's on? Maybe if I hold it like this, or...
Can we get a replacement?
Now you can hear me very well. Sorry. All right. Great. So our work at the center is focused on how to create prosperity in developing countries. And we actually have one program that is destined to this question of how is it that countries grow, which is a question that has puzzled economies for centuries. And the approach that we use, one that Sean alluded to at the Atlas, is a very empirical one, where we've studied 130 countries through their exports for the last 50 years, using over 1,000 products. And we've just studied what happened, what's the trajectory of countries that actually prosper and grow. And we have found 3 things, and some of them I think are a little bit counterintuitive to how we think about this puzzle. One is that countries that grow and prosper diversify. They make more things and more complex things. So countries that grow don't focus on a few things and do those really well and then trade. You know, countries that grow, they diversify, they make more things and more complex things. And the way that they do it, number 2, is by accumulating capabilities. Now, these capabilities come in a variety of forms. Their human talent, their know-how, their roads, their infrastructure, their good regulation, and that are very specific to each product. And if you think about the game of Scrabble, I think it's a good analogy to think of this, you know, where capabilities are the letters that you accumulate. And the more letters you have, you know, the more words you can make, and the more complex or longer words you can make. And it's similarly with products and services in the economy. And the third thing that we've learned through this work is that that process of growth is path dependent, which means where you're going to go and how you're going to diversify depends on what you make and are able to do right now. So there are products that are better than others in the path toward diversification. And believe it or not, we think that this framework can also be applied and thought of when we think about sports.
If I may just take a little moment and just sort of drill down on that. That's in terms of broader general economy. But when you think about major sporting events and the role that major sporting events, and how does that really fit with the broader strategic, thinking and the center's thinking around economic development? So, for example, you mentioned diversity. How would sport really act as a driver to create diversity in an economy, particularly already in an established economy, for example?
Yeah, so we've started this project, and we started this project with the support with ICSS, and all questions are on the table and bringing rigor to this process. And what we realized is something that was mentioned by the previous speaker, is that I think the job of everybody in the room is very hard. Making decisions and policy decisions on major events and the sports sector in general is very difficult, partly because there's no consensus on the issues that we talked about of how we define in the general sports industry, how we define sports, how we want to measure them. Is it revenues? Is it value add? And then specifically in sports events, what are really the spillovers of these events, and what is it that determines whether a country can appropriate those benefits or not. And if you think about examples that vary, because there's not a lack of studies, there's just lack of consensus on how we realistically measure this. And if we think about the World Cup in Brazil, and you have studies that go from $500 million to $7.2 billion. I mean, there's no, public policy official that can make a reasonable decision with such a huge variety between those two estimates. And what we find that has become helpful in analyzing the industry is this sense of the capabilities and the know-how embedded in your economy that allows you to appropriate the benefits of these sporting events. Because there are things that are consumed locally, right? You do an event and people eat, they drink, they're in hotels, you have ticket sales, and those are local. But actually the multiplier effect of those activities is relatively low. Like $1 demanded in those activities does not generate a lot more money in other industries. But then there are other higher, more complex activities, broadcasting, advertisement, franchises, merchandising, where a lot of the value gets appropriated, and that depends on whether your economy, your city, your firms are able to play in those industries. And sometimes that's irrelevant on whether you're hosting the event or not. So going back to this issue of Scrabble, it's what capabilities and know-how you have in your economy that allows you to appropriate the spillovers realistically of the industries that have most of the value.
Right. Thank you. Manuel, Mexico has had the good fortune to host a number of major sporting events. It actually had the games, Guadalajara. Can you share with us some of the insights and some of the lessons and some examples of where these games as major events have actually had an impact on economic growth, and perhaps also a few words around not just economic growth, but how that's also led to some positive benefits for society as a whole, please.
Claro que sí, gracias. Buenas tardes a todos. Antes que nada, gracias a la invitación de la OEA, del Instituto de Seguridad del Deporte. Y bueno, quería plantear un poco la pregunta que haces, Sean, en dos cosas. Sí es cierto que México ha tenido la oportunidad de organizar Juegos Centroamericanos, Juegos Panamericanos, Juegos Olímpicos, 2 campeonatos mundiales. México se presta porque tiene pues la infraestructura, la calidez, la gente, en fin, ¿no? Un país sobre todo muy cálido para ese tipo de cosas. Pero también la parte de la infraestructura deportiva que tuvo que implementar México es muy diferente unos Juegos Olímpicos a unos campeonatos mundiales de fútbol. O sea, el campeonato mundial de fútbol sí, obviamente es un evento, a lo mejor el máximo a nivel de audiencia, el máximo de que la gente lo ve, pero realmente el impacto que tiene en la sociedad deportivamente hablando es poco. ¿En qué sentido? Al ser el fútbol soccer el deporte más popular del mundo y que lo practican en casi todos los países del mundo, nos hemos abocado, inclusive en este foro que estamos empezando, a hablar solamente del tema del fútbol, ¿no? Y de la inseguridad, como fueron los panelistas anteriores, y de cómo se está tratando. Y el deporte no solamente es el fútbol. Cabe señalar que yo fui futbolista profesional, no es que odie el fútbol, pero el trabajar en el Ministerio del Deporte de México y que a mí me ha apasionado todos los deportes, me lleva a comentar esto, ¿no? En México, gracias a la infraestructura y a este tipo de eventos que organizamos, el nivel de nuestros deportistas y el nivel del deporte mexicano en estas disciplinas de Juegos Olímpicos ha subido. Y yo, por ejemplo, les pongo una estadística, ¿no? En los Juegos Olímpicos de Londres, pues nosotros tuvimos por primera vez, específicamente en la disciplina de tiro con arco, una semifinal, y en la semifinal estaban 2 mexicanas. Bueno, ese evento que se pasó en México, en vivo, tuvo un rating de 35% y pasó a la 1 de la tarde. Una final del fútbol mexicano tiene un rating de 40%. O sea, quiere decir que el hecho de que hubiera 2 mexicanos y el hecho de que del evento que trascendía casi estuvo a la par de una final de fútbol soccer. Pero va más allá de eso. A raíz de que terminaron los Juegos Olímpicos, nosotros en el Ministerio del Deporte llegaron alrededor de más de 3,000 solicitudes de crear escuelas de tiro con arco en México, ¿no? Cosa que realmente hoy en México existían a lo mejor 20 o 30 escuelas de tiro con arco en el 2012. A raíz de esos éxitos deportivos, la gente y sobre todo la sociedad quiere participar y sobre todo quiere hacer otro tipo de disciplinas y no solamente el fútbol o el béisbol, o, bueno, en fin, ¿no? Entonces creo que ese es el impacto que tienen los deportes o el deporte en la sociedad. Independientemente de que la infraestructura deportiva, cuando organizas un evento importante, la tienes ahí, esa infraestructura deportiva, y lo decía en su intervención el Comité Olímpico Internacional, que no se vuelvan en esos elefantes blancos. Y ese elefante blanco es que la unidad deportiva tenga vida. ¿Por qué? Porque ¿para qué hacemos una alberca? Vienen los Juegos Panamericanos o los Juegos Olímpicos y después de eso la alberca no se utiliza, ni para clases de natación, iniciación deportiva, en fin. Entonces no le damos vida a esas unidades deportivas y al no darle vida, obviamente no generas los recursos para poderla mantener, obviamente la sociedad no la usa, que para eso se generó, y pasamos al problema de que la gente no se activa o simplemente no hace ejercicio. Entonces, creo que, para resumir rápidamente en esta primera intervención, es lo que te deja un evento deportivo en una ciudad no es tanto la derrama económica o la infraestructura deportiva, porque esa a final de cuentas se queda y, como decía Marcela, la gente se va, no tienes un impacto económico, no generas empleos, pero que sí generas, que para nosotros es lo más importante, es que la población, y en este caso los mexicanos, puedan practicar diferentes deportes y que no solamente vean el fútbol como un deporte absoluto, sino que puedan participar en diferentes deportes, y eso va a crecer el deporte del país y por ende a la población de ese país, ¿no?
Thank you, Manuel. So it would appear to me that you're obviously an advocate of multi-use facilities. In other words, when you think about planning stadia for large events, that there should be better thought that goes into actually how do you use that stadium, not just for one sport, i.e. football, for example, or athletics, but for multiple use. Is that correct?
Es correcto. Obviamente, si tú haces una infraestructura, por decir un ejemplo, de un estadio de tenis, o sea, el estadio de tenis, sí tienes un estadio de tenis y solamente se puede practicar el tenis, ¿no? Pero cuando tú haces una unidad deportiva en la cual simple y sencillamente tenga una cancha de fútbol o una pista de tartán, ahí solamente en ese espacio puedes practicar 5 deportes, ¿no? O sea, el atletismo, el fútbol, el lanzamiento de bala, el lanzamiento de jabalina, en fin, hay varios deportes, inclusive el tiro con arco. Hay varios deportes que se pueden utilizar y para eso precisamente debe utilizarse la infraestructura deportiva, para que se puedan practicar varios eventos y no solo uno, que sí, en el caso de Guadalajara, después del estadio de tenis que realizaron para los Panamericanos, si no traes un evento internacional, Copa Davis, un torneo patrocinado de nivel de ATP que pueda generar puntos, que será un evento o 2 al año, si no traes esos eventos, pues el estadio está vacío o el estadio está cerrado o el estadio no lo usa. Pero cuando tú tienes en el estado que esto está en Guadalajara, en el estado de Jalisco, cuando tú tienes en el estado más de 1,000 tenistas juveniles desde niños hasta 20 años, entonces ese estadio sí tiene una razón de ser y sí tiene la vida que realmente le estás dando al crear esa infraestructura deportiva, sí para un evento grande, pero que a final de cuentas vas a utilizarlo en el día al día en todo lo que es tu población y tu comunidad y no en los eventos internacionales.
Now, without asking you to, name countries or put you in the spot in that regard, are you, in your opinion, starting to see that this approach has actually been, or this approach has actually been learned across the region, with upcoming events in the region? Are you seeing evidence of, this earlier start around planning for legacy, as we call it, an earlier thought going into the design of facilities that's actually now starting to, to manifest itself much more across the region with different countries that are about to host events?
Bueno, obviamente en el continente, pues sí, existen países que superan obviamente a México en infraestructura y hay otros que no. Yo te podría hablar, en base a la pregunta que tú me comentas, que la mayoría de los países han crecido, ¿no? Han crecido independientemente de su infraestructura. A lo mejor ese país no tiene la posibilidad de trabajar el deporte, ¿no? en el país porque no tiene esa infraestructura, pero sí buscan en otros países ir a buscar esa participación y sobre todo buscar esa preparación, ¿no? Y bueno, pues, obviamente Estados Unidos, Canadá, Brasil, Colombia, en fin, tienen esa parte que pueden ir de otros países tanto a practicar como campamentos, como mejorar su rendimiento o sus técnicas. México sí ha crecido a raíz de estos eventos, pero también han crecido otros países y lo vemos constantemente en diferentes disciplinas que participan atletas de países. El caso a lo mejor más sonado en el mundo es el caso de Jamaica, ¿no? La Jamaica ha entendido que no puedes trabajar todos los deportes y ser bueno en todos los deportes. Dijo, bueno, pues nuestro prototipo de gente o de atleta es la velocidad. Y en la velocidad son los mejores del mundo. Habríamos que entender, o habrá que entender algunos países, que no puedes ser competitivo en todos los deportes, pero sí te tienes que especializar en 4 o 5 donde eres fuerte y entonces apostar a eso sin descuidar los demás, ¿no?
Thank you. Rose, USAID. What's its philosophy, given the experience, the years that you spent at USAID now, looking at the role of sport when it comes to both economic as well as social development? Would you say that sport is regarded more, would USAID see sport more as a lever for social development as opposed to economic development? Your thoughts?
Well, first, thank you very much for the invitation to participate today. I think USAID is the development agency of the United States government, and we have a strong history over 50 years in working towards development outcomes throughout Latin America. Right now, some of our key development outcomes include strengthening democratic values, creating conditions where citizens feel safe in their communities, and strengthening national institutions so that they can best provide services to their citizens. And those institutions would include civil society organizations, national governments, the private sector, and local governments. And our philosophy on sports is we have viewed that for many years as sport being an integral part and harnessing the power of sport at the local community to allow us to develop programming which helps us achieve the types of development outcomes that we've been we are looking to do. And it's interesting to me to hear about measuring and the importance of measurement. That's something that USAID is particularly interested in how do we measure whether particular activities, many of which include sports outreach, whether they are in fact contributing to the development outcomes that we're looking for. So we don't work on sports sort of as an individual economic driver, but as a critical tool in achieving the development outcomes that collectively we're looking for in the international community. And I'll just give you a quick example, if I might, of one of our programs. We work on the Aganar activity. We fund it together with the Inter-American Development Bank. We work in 16 countries around the region, and it's implemented by Partners of the Americas. It is a program to incorporate a sports methodology into academic curriculum, into out-of-school, after-school activities, with the objectives of building citizenship, building teamwork, teaching at-risk kids how to develop resilience, and with the outcomes being that the kids should stay in school, get back into school, be able to obtain employment, or be able to start their own business. So we're not looking to develop sports stars, but we are looking to develop strong, confident, capable members of the community. And we are trying to measure this program. We have a longitudinal study which has started up a few years ago. It's a 5-year program, but we're looking at our activities particularly in Honduras and in Guatemala. And that may be of interest to some of you because this particular program is very sports directed? How effective will it be in increasing the development outcomes that we're looking for? And if I just also mention the importance in our programming of working with local organizations. These are very much partnerships with municipalities, with strong civil society entities, with faith-based organizations, and with the private sector. Without those local relationships, we would not be successful. It would not work for us to come and attempt to impose a particular sport or methodology or action onto a community. So we very much work so each of the neighborhoods may have a slightly different set of interventions that the program is working on. So far we've reached 11,000 at-risk youth in 16 countries, and the preliminary data are showing that over 60% of the youth, after they complete this type of a sports methodology program, are able to stay in school, get back into school, find formal employment, or start a business. So it's an important aspect, it's an important tool for us in economic and social stability and development.
Very much, Rose. You know, I've got a long list of questions I could go through, but I don't want to dominate that, so I'm conscious of the time as well. I think we have about, at this stage, 7 minutes left over. So I'd like to open it up to the floor and invite any of the delegates to direct a question at any one of the panelists or to the panel in general. Any questions? I don't see any questions coming from the floor, so while we're waiting for someone to either pluck up the courage to ask the question or to field a question, Rose, let me go back to you and pose one of you. USAID involved obviously in aid development in developing countries, probably about to be stung by something, but that's fine. The question I have for you is, do you think that when we come specifically to major sporting events and the amount of investment that goes into major sporting events, would you say that this is actually justified in countries that, you know, could perhaps rather divert or use the funding that goes into major sporting events, you know, into other social programs? You know, it's almost a bit like, you know, trying to invest money into something which you can't afford. Your view on that in general, you know? Or would you say that, nevertheless, these major events do act as a significant catalyst, particularly to bring about, you know, social change?
They serve as significant opportunities for engagement by the communities, by civil society groups, to address that question of how will these major sporting events be utilized in a way that creates a lasting development outcome, particularly for at-risk youth and vulnerable populations. So I view it, you know, it's going to stay, but it is an opportunity to open that dialogue, to create those linkages, to establish longer-term relationships at the community level, which over the long run will create conditions for more successful sporting events, create a civil society where it's not acceptable to engage in violence or hooliganism, and you have those relationships in place to address those issues well in advance. We have, for example, a partnership with Major League Baseball and the Dominican Republic, which is a kind of a cool relationship where the Major League, in the Dominican Republic, the baseball players in the Major League Baseball are creating those types of relationships with local communities in the DR with the objective of helping kids stay in school, managing gender-based violence, working with people with disabilities. So it's those kinds, seems to me, those kinds of opportunities that could present themselves within the context of major sporting events as they are rolled out in different locations.
Marcelo, you know, moving from evolving countries to, you know, I guess cities that are fairly well established, we've seen that there's quite a bit of controversy around, you know, the Boston Olympic bid, or should we say the no Boston vote. I'm not going to ask you to pronounce whether Boston should do it or not, but I'd just like to ask you, how should cities or countries that are contemplating, you know, hosting major events, how should they think strategically about these investments that they make?
We have a question. So just to answer your question quickly, yeah, in Boston, I recently moved to Cambridge, which has been voted the most opinionated zip code in the US, so everybody has an opinion, definitely. But I think the way that we think about it with our framework, if we go back to the Scrabble analogy, is whether your investments are strategic to the activities that are relevant to your environment. So if you want to get in the Scrabble, if you are building an A, which is, let's say, improving the transport system internally within the city so that people can get to work easily after you do the event, that's helpful for a variety of industries that are currently in your environment. If you build an X or a Q, which is maybe a big stadium, it's got very few opportunities to redeploy that asset for other activities beyond the specific event. And thinking about whether the event allows you to focus on the actual infrastructure investments that you're going to utilize. Because everybody gives the example of Barcelona. It was a tourism destination. You use the World Cup to, or the event to actually improve the beachfront, more tourists are going to come. But if you don't have investments or potential investment opportunities within your economy, then creating the event is not going to bring new investments. It has to work within the current capabilities that you have, because it by itself is not going to create a change. And the way you posed the question was super important, because I think a lot more is at stake for poorer countries, where the trade-offs for spending billions of dollars on these events are not only within the sports industry, which is a very important one, but within the greater economy.
Question from the floor.
No.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Lorraine Nicholas, representing the Organization of Eastern Caribbean States. This question is for Marcela. Marcela, you made mention of a study which examined the various exports in 130 countries. I was wondering to what extent you looked at exports in the service sector, particularly tourism, given that the islands of the Caribbean, this is really our focus area in terms of economic development. Thank you.
I actually worked previously in the Caribbean. I worked with the music industry in Jamaica and the tourism industry in Jamaica and the tourism industry in Colombia at the time, where it was harder to attract tourists. And those are huge and important industries for the region. And the question of, and that tourism we see as an export consumed locally, right? It brings foreign currency, it's super important. And I think it's an industry where the strategy of the country is a long-term one, right? To differentiate yourself within the region, within the world as a tourism destination. I remember a lot of our work in the Caribbean, in Jamaica, was telling hotels that, you're not competing against the hotel in the beach across from you. You are competing with a hotel in Cancun, with a hotel in other destinations where you have to say, okay, what is Jamaican, right? It's not just a beach and a cheap hotel room. It is the music, it is the food, it is, all these things that make Jamaica different than the Dominican Republic, etc. And I think if you can utilize people understanding your culture and what you have to offer that's differentiated beyond the one-time event, then it can have returns on tourism. But your long-term strategy is a differentiation strategy for tourism that has to be, continually reinvented and grounded in the culture of your environment.
Another question here, thank you. Can we get a mic up to the front, please?
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank all panelists for expressing your thoughts and opinions, and I also would like to thank you, Cher, for your introductory remarks on this topic. I will be very neutral in my question, and I would like to be understanding by all of you. I think that all here in this room, we agreed that, yes, the major sporting events can contribute to the social economic development. This is no doubt. We had some figures, etc., mentioned by the keynote speakers, Mr. Guterres. Now, my question is, should we distinguish the size of the major sporting events to be hosted in developed countries and to be hosted in developed countries? You understand my question? There's a distinguish the size of the major sporting events or not?
Right.
Because this leads us to think about the sustainability and so on, and resilience we talked previously. Thank you.
Should I see if one of the panelists want to answer that, or Rose or Marcelo?
From a development perspective, the constraints on less developed countries would be significant. You know, the ability of civil society to stand up against the expenditure of considerable amounts of money, when in fact that may not really be in the best interests of the community. But the community isn't organized well enough to resist that. So I think yes, there would need to be some consideration on the power relationships. What are the power relationships of the people making the decisions vis-a-vis the vulnerable communities who do not have access to those power structures? So yeah, from a development perspective, these are important considerations.
If I may just add to that, you know, without sort of getting into a huge debate about this, but I think, you know, there's something to be considered. When we looked at the last World Cup in South Africa and they looked at the average cost of building 7 stadia seats, the cost for the 7 stadia seats equated to a modest school library. So it gets down to a question of being pragmatic. And I think if we know that there's and this is why legacy is so important, if we are able to think ahead and to develop a well-structured, well-thought-out legacy plan, to understand how the utilization of that investment is going to truly lead to sustained economic development. Even if that economic development is not going to be the whole country, that's usually impossible because major events are hosted where the rubber meets the road in a city or in a series of cities. And it's really about to what extent in that precinct around where that event takes place, it's going to lead to economic opportunities and through to some level of social beneficiation. There's, of course, the extended corridors like the infrastructure. Cities, countries invest in upgrading their rail or road transit from the airport to the precinct. If along that corridor, that new infrastructure is going to lend itself to improve conditions for people to be able to commute, to increase their opportunities or their ability to be able to, you know, get effective, affordable transportation to places of work so that they can actually hold down jobs, then I think there's a question to be made for it. But I think it comes back to the core fundamental principle, which is this should, you know, legacy should not be a bolt-on. It should not be the last minute or an afterthought. It's got to be thought of at the point of decision to whether or not the country, the city is going to even bid. I'm told to wrap up, so with that, thank you very much for the questions. I would like to really sincerely thank the panelists, Rose, Marcelo. Marcelo, you know, despite the fact that you wasn't feeling 100% today, we appreciate the effort. Manuel, thank you very much for your contribution, and thank you everybody from the audience. Thank you.